Today we're going to be talking with Harriet as part of the Tireless Readers Collective because we really want to bring together people who love reading, who love talking about issues that impact women and girls, and we want to bring writers who can sort of shine a spotlight on issues of gender justice and equality. Andrea, do you want to just talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely. So folks, as you know, our organization, we really focus on building up gender equity and gender justice. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that in this crisis that we're in right now, the pandemic, it's really shone a spotlight on the idea that we need gender justice to stop and prevent these things from happening. We need a fairer Canada. And especially for folks who are dealing with marginalization, dealing with things like racism and ableism and homophobia, transphobia. And in the words of one of our founding mothers, Rosemary Brown, she said, until all of us have made it, none of us has made it. So today, as we talk with Harriet, please do consider getting involved. As Suzanne has said, there's lots of ways that you can do so. As she said, you can make a donation, you can get involved with our future events. You can definitely go to our website and find all the ways that you can get involved with our campaigns and just address these issues on a long-term basis. And really, I think one of the things that we would like to start all of our events with when we have this opportunity is acknowledge the fact that we are on Indigenous land today. The work that we do and the programs that we support take place on First Nations, Métis, and Inuit land. We're really grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land, and we're absolutely committed to continuing to pursue truth and reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. Just want to mention to you as well, too, that if you have any questions, we're going to get to a Q&A portion. Hopefully, we'll get the opportunity to speak your questions to Harriet about her book. So please go ahead and type all your questions into the chat function. If you see down below, it's that Q&A little box there. And any questions that you have about Harriet's book or Harriet's writing process, please go ahead and we'll get to that hopefully by the end of the session. I'll pass it back to you, Suzanne.
I want to just give everyone a quick content note on this. Our discussion today is going to touch on Harriet's experience with cancer. And we know that many folks are affected by cancer and touched by cancer. They've experienced it personally or have had a family or a friend who has. So please do exercise self-care. Take a break if you need to. Rejoin if you need to take a break. Rejoin when you're ready. And just a technical note as well, if we get cut off, just rejoin. We'll be back. We'll be right back here and having this conversation. And as Andrea said along the way, we're going to throw some questions to the audience. We're going to ask you to put things in the Q&A. You're welcome to also be in the chat. We've got folks who are helping answer questions in the chat. You're also going to see some polls come up. We'll ask you to respond to those. And we're going to do a little bit of brainstorming in the chat as well to get everybody's juices flowing around this book and get a really good conversation going. So if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to work those in, and we'll have lots of other ways for you to engage. Andrea, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about tonight?
Yes. So Harriet, before Harriet wrote her memoir, Natural Killer, she wrote a novel called The Honey Farm, and I feel really privileged because I got a chance to read it. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, Happy Reader, all kinds of publications. She's just a prolific writer in lots of different places. She also founded a literary magazine called Her Royal Majesty. It ran for 6 years and republished the first ever short story by Alice Munro, which is awesome. She lives in Ontario. She's with her partner and her son and 2 dogs. Thank you again for joining us. And I'm just going to jump right into it. We have a brainstorm question that we wanted to ask everybody to just participate in the chat area there. Think back to when you were 15 years old. What was your favorite book back then? I'm going to ask Suzanne to give me a sense of her favorite book. I'm going to ask Harriet next, and I'm going to tell you mine. Suzanne.
I think when I was 15, I really loved the chrysalids. I've always really enjoyed speculative fiction, and that one really, really touched me and kind of got me in a really deep science fiction and speculative fiction path.
Sweet.
Harriet, what about you?
It was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. And I haven't reread that book, but I remember specifically that that was my favorite book, especially right before I went into the hospital, because I just finished reading it and my parents and I asked the librarian if they could find more books by Betty Smith for me.
Oh, when your parents get involved with it, yes, it means that you did love it. My favorite book back then was called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And I just can't remember the name of the writer who, I'll have to look it up while we're talking, but it was a part of like a 10 book series about a family that lived in Jim Crow South in the States. And it was just so, it just pulled you right in. And it followed the young protagonist from childhood all the way to her adulthood. So it was such an epic series. I'll try to find the name of the author, but I see someone has mentioned Alice in Wonderland. We have a lot of, Mildred Taylor, thank you, yes. Mildred D. Taylor. Alice in Wonderland was another one that somebody had mentioned there. And I think the kind of thing that you read when you're 15-year-old, maybe that forms your tastes and your loves for the rest of your life. Would you say that, Harriet?
Yeah, like I'm trying to remember what A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is about, and I don't remember, but I remember it being very character driven and very touched into the inner life and the emotional life of this young girl. And I also remember it being kind of a melancholy book, and I feel like I'm drawn to melancholy stories a lot of the time. So I do think that that resonates. And like Big is a big book, and I love big books.
I just read it this year. I was the first time reading it. It was so great and really worth a reread. She has a job at one point where she just compiles clippings. And I was reflecting that it was like early Google. Her whole job's reading 2,000 newspapers a day and doing all of the clippings, and this room full of women all acting as Google to send out the clippings to folks.
I really do need to reread it.
Yeah, it's great. Really great. So speaking of 15, Harriet, let's move over to talk about the book a little bit. The book starts when you're 15, and you're catapulted into a life-threatening situation. You wrote in the book, I did not fear death. I did not even consider it. I immediately framed the situation so that my only problem was time. So this book wasn't just a personal journey. It also speaks about how your family experienced the illness together. And I'm wondering, now that you're sort of grown up and have a child of your own, what are some of the insights you gained as you were trying to cope as a family during this time?
I think that my parents worked very hard to instill like confidence. I never got the sense that they were afraid on my behalf. But also definitely I wanted to know all of the information. I wanted to be in charge. I was 15, so I didn't have to be told all of this. I guess as a minor, it's the parents' discretion as to what they tell the child. But I asked tons of questions. I was really on the ball. I sought knowledge and I asked questions. I would tell the nurse, like, you didn't put my bolus of saline in before doing that drug, and that's required. And they'd be like, oh, okay. And obviously that didn't happen a lot. I'm not a nurse, and my nurses were wonderful. But I think that, yeah, instilling confidence, instilling hope. I think that I had faith from the beginning that I would live for whatever reason. I didn't think that I was going to die at the beginning. I did feel much closer to death as I was going through my sickness. But yeah, the information is power, and hope makes life more bearable.
I've got the next question there along those lines. You did write a piece in the Globe and Mail more recently, and you shared how your experience helped you deal with the pandemic, or at least some aspects of the pandemic. Can you share more about those lessons for us? We're asking for a friend.
Andrew, before you mute, I have a feeling that when you mute, your face doesn't appear anymore for the participants.
Oh.
Be quiet and keep yourself not on mute. I'm not sure.
Yeah, participants, you want to see my face, don't you? So I'm going to keep it unmuted, and I'll try not to make too many noises.
You're nodding so lovely, so just keep your face. But yeah, I think that, to be honest, a writer doesn't choose the headline, and I do think that the headline of that article made it seem like I had all these lessons to give. But I think that a big thing for me was to let go of expectation. There's this feeling of surrendering, and I felt at my most anxious and sad during the pandemic, when I am really dead set on something happening by a certain day that I've decided it should happen. Like I wanted to put my son in daycare by September, and then when time came, it just didn't feel like the right choice, and we made alternate arrangements. And but I was just so upset at the thought that that might not happen. But then knowing that you can change plans along the way. So this feeling of surrendering, I think, has helped me a lot. And the letting go of things becoming normal by a certain day. And I still have hope that things will return to the way that the things that we miss, we'll be able to do those things soon. But I also think that one of the main things I talked about in that Globe and Mail piece is that normal will always be different now, even if it is normal. And I hope that that feels more magical as a result. Like I definitely felt like when I got out of the hospital, even on day passes, and then when I got back home again, the normal things, and my parents felt this too, it's noted in the journals that I know we're going to talk about later, it just felt so magical that I could not be plugged into an IV and go to the movies and see the leaves on the trees. Like, I just think that hopefully our filters will be sort of reprogrammed after this, and the things that we took for granted will just seem more special.
Harriet, thank you so much for that. What you're saying actually was what stuck with me in this book. As soon as I closed the book, I read it in like 3 days or 2 days. I'm not a fast reader, but I was just so engaged in it. So that's just something about your writing and the way that you conveyed your story. It really stuck with me that everything is pretty much magical. Like we act like it's normal to have things like breeze and atoms that stay together, and our bodies, our brains, you know, we think these are normal things. It's just that we're used to them. They might as well be magic. And that's what I got from this, that life might as well be magic, and treat it like that. And you'll be okay. You'll be able to handle things like a pandemic and shocks like this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Harriet, I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction now. And I was thinking while I was reading this, I was thinking a lot about the health team that surrounded you and the healthcare workers, and the role that they play in this story. You know, it struck me that like right now we're talking about essential workers, we're talking about frontline workers, and we're talking about them more than ever. And these are jobs that diverse women do. There often are, you know, women who are racialized doing these jobs. And I'm wondering what you think needs to happen to us as a society to better value these workers right now and in the future going forward.
I totally hear you that those communities those populations are often the least respected among the healthcare workers, but I do think that so many of the healthcare workers are also privileged and white too. And I think that in my experience, I had such a deep respect and that's a familiarity that developed with my healthcare workers, the nurses and the phlebotomists who would draw my blood, and the doctors. And I think anyone who's spent time as a patient or a caregiver in a hospital understands the incredible work that all of these people do. And so it's not hard to have empathy for what they're going for. And I think that if like it turns to friendship, really. Like I was friends with so many of my nurses. They were people I spent so much time with. They knew my days. They knew how to talk to patients very well, whereas a lot of friends, there's a disconnect. So I think that I had a deeper connection with much of my healthcare staff than I had with lots of friends who might come once a month. And that's a lot for a teenager living in the suburbs, having to commute down to the hospital in Toronto. But just the familiarity of these people. And I think that if someone hasn't had that experience firsthand or secondhand, then just listening to the people who have, or listening to the workers who are doing that, it's pretty easy to see how important they are.
All right, I'm going to ask a question of the audience. It's a bit of a poll. And I really want us to think about this because it's something that we're talking about now, this idea of not going back to normal in every way. We have to reset normal. So do you think that the public focus on frontline and essential workers, and that's all essential workers. I'm talking people who are in grocery store. I'm talking people who are doing cleaning, as much as I'm talking about frontline healthcare workers, frontline community-based workers. Do you think that the public focus on them will actually stick after the pandemic? And so I'm going to just do this poll. If you get the opportunity, please let us know. Do you think it's going to stick, or do you think it's going to kind of fade off? And just looking for your answers. Go ahead. I'm seeing votes come in. Keeping it open for a few more seconds. And I'm going to share the results. So a lot of folks feel that no, the essential workers will not get the public focus after this. I find that really interesting. I think one of the things that we do have to try our best to do at the Canadian Women's Foundation, and we ask all of you, let's continue to do what we can to keep putting the focus on these folks who have really in many ways kept us alive and supported us all through this awful pandemic, and they themselves are struggling with it as well. It's really important given the fact that also many of them tend to be women and gender diverse people, and we have to stop devaluing their work, I think. So I'm going to throw it back to Suzanne.
Thanks, Andrea. Want to go back to the book now and sort of talk about the relationship with the body. And so you mentioned in the course of the treatment that you began to feel like your body didn't belong to you. And I remember one particular scene where you were talking about waking up from a surgery and seeing iodine lines on your body and thinking like, you know, these lines have been painted on by doctors and you felt more like a patient and a subject. This idea that nothing was yours anymore. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about your shifting relationship to your body, your autonomy over your body, and how did that change through the book? And how has that changed as you grew and experienced life and became a mother?
I think that, funnily enough, the reason that I was able to write this book when I was pregnant, like it's sort of all, I've been thinking about this book for my whole life, but I started writing it really as a book, as this book when I was pregnant, and it sort of clicked and made sense to me in a way that it hadn't before. And I think it's because my mindset was oddly similar. Like there's so much fear of the body when you're sick. Like it felt like my body had betrayed me, and it felt like I didn't know what was going on and why it had done that. And then there's also so much fear when you're pregnant. There's this fear that you can do something wrong and harm the life of your baby inside of you, or that something will happen totally out of your control. And this sense of vulnerability and just letting go, like the surrendering that I talked about before, like pregnancy happens without you doing anything. Like the baby is going to grow, just you don't have to make it happen. And same with fighting the cancer cells in my body. Like the chemo was doing that. I didn't need to do anything. And just letting go to this system of the way that it works, I felt they were sort of similar, and there's like an inevitability that it felt like, and the feeling that my body wasn't mine. Like the body wasn't mine, as you said in that scene, but also during pregnancy, it's like my body is also another body. It's hosting this new body and making that body happen. And so I think that the feeling of autonomy has changed as I've grown up, but as I write about in the book, there was a constant fear after I was discharged from the hospital that it would come back. And so I think that one of the things that I talk about in the book is just how that shapes people forever, how experiences shape us forever, and we might not have anticipated that.
Okay, my turn. So the book is really interesting in the format because you weave in artifacts, things like notes and files from the hospital, as well as your parents' daily journal of your health status and treatment. What was it like to review those artifacts and go back through that journey in such detail?
It was very moving. The journals were something that were almost attempting to be like medical records. There was a neutrality to them and a log. It was really like a captain's ship log of what happened, 10:05, this happened, 11:07, this doctor came in, administered these drugs. Harriet's temperature was this, blood counts came back as this. But of course, there's so much emotion that comes through, even in the most simple of word choices. And the journals were something that were familiar to me. I carried them around for my appointments when I would go in afterwards. I often wrote updates, so they didn't feel like this foreign or mythical object, but I hadn't read through them like a book ever until I started writing this. And the experience reading through them was similar to reading my medical journals, where I didn't realize how much there was that I didn't know, how much I'd forgotten, how much I was just unaware of because I was in like a total fog of sickness. And it was like piecing together this life that was kind of different from the story I had told myself of what had happened. Like I was fine and now I'm well. And now it's like, I wasn't fine. Like I didn't realize how close I came to not being fine. And it felt really scary, really. Like it's like the suspense novel where I'm like, oh my God, like this patient is not doing very well. Like this, I hope she lives. And it did feel really suspenseful. And it was quite humbling in a way to be reminded of all of these people who are caring for me and monitoring me. And obviously my parents were caring for me and loving me, but even the doctors and nurses, so much love came through in their notes, and joy when my fever finally broke, and concern, like nurses' notes were always saying like, this patient needs a lot of support right now. This patient is feeling really worried. Her parents are really worried. And so it was really an incredible experience to read about myself in this sort of neutral way.
Really great, Harriet. And I think, as someone who's never really written journals, I was thinking a lot about artifacts and what it would be like to have this almost empirical record, and like in the medical files as well. Obviously, there's a story happening behind them, but to have those anchors in time is really interesting. And I have a question for everybody that's here to put into the chat. I'm wondering, what artifacts of your childhood exist? If aliens came 100 years from now and somehow found artifacts of your childhood, what would be the things that they would find there? I was thinking, as somebody who's not really kept a lot until adulthood, probably they would just find a long trail of doll clothes that I had made for various dolls out of various things. I don't think there's anything much more tangible than that. Andrea, what about you? Do you have artifacts? Were you a journaler? Are there things that people could come?
I was not a journaler. I was just thinking, what would it have been? I'm old enough to have had those, you would listen to the radio and tape it so that you could listen to it afterwards. That was your version of a CD, or not even a CD, that was your Spotify. So I remember listening to Buffalo radio stations, like only the Buffalo radio stations would play like R&B and hip hop and the kinds of stuff that I would listen to. There wasn't in Canada stations. And I remember just like trying to tape it so that I get the top and you would have to listen in the background to hear the song that you wanted easing in. So they would find a lot of really weird cuts and lots and lots of tapes that are just tapes of the radio. And they'd be like, what was the technology like such that you needed to do this? But they will know it was terrible. What about you?
I see Angie's written in the chat as well that she lost a lot of the artifacts of her childhood due to the Gulf War in the 1990s. She was in Kuwait and had to leave when she was 19, and that's part of the story in her unfinished novel. And I think that sort of does have so much to do with having family in a place where things are stored, and I think that does make a bit of a difference there. Harriet, I'm interested in you talking about bringing those artifacts with you. And I didn't realize that I thought, I had this imagination of you climbing up to a dusty attic and sort of blowing off the dust from things. I didn't realize that they were sort of living and breathing items for you.
Yeah, well, one of the first notebook was like our notebook that we kept by the phone for messages, and then I was like, oh, better bring it. So it like wasn't this reverent thing. And yeah, my dad is an engineer and teaches people how to fly, and so he's like very used to these logbooks, and so he'd be like, going to your checkup, bring the journal. And I might not have been, I might not have done that on my own, but I'm really glad that those records exist, and they were encouraged to do that. I think a lot of parents at sick kids are told that it's good, especially if parents are, you're tired, things are happening all night long. But it's also, my parents switched off every other night, so they could kind of go through the previous day and see what had happened. And then occasionally family would, like aunts would come and stay with me, and they would do the journal if my parents like once or twice went out for dinner or something. And so it was just like, yeah, this archive.
Andrea, just before you move on to the next question, I was just looking at the questions in the Q&A. There's lots coming in. We'll get to some of them, but one really links to this. Somebody's wondering if it was difficult to get some of the medical notes, some of the medical documentation that's in here. Was that a difficult process to get those things?
It actually wasn't. I was a patient at Sick Kids throughout the entire time, and all of the notes were taken on paper. But since, I'm not sure when this project would have started, but all of the paper documents between a certain period have been scanned in. And so I just went to the basement of Sick Kids. I can't remember, I think I would have asked my doctor, like, how can I find these? And they said, well, they'll all be in the basement in the archives section. And I had to make an appointment. It wasn't very difficult. They printed off and mailed me the like paper copies of things that I might have wanted copies for, was to bring back home. And they're all scanned in, and yeah, there's so much paperwork. Like, and most of it is just so boring. It's like, this was a test that was requisitioned. Here, you need to go get this X-ray, and here's the pictures of the X-ray or whatever.
So one of the themes I think that you come back to a lot actually is how people interpret illness and interpret how they respond to somebody going through an illness. And you reflect and say the things that people say about these challenges. For example, somebody saying everything happens for a reason or something like that. And you mentioned that these remarks might very well be a well-intended thing, but you speak to that distinction between intent versus impact in these situations of illness. Tell us more about this and what you think people can do just practically to be more mindful of our approach when we're speaking to somebody who's maybe going through an illness.
That's a great question. And I'm so glad you asked me about like a practical advice, because I think that I have thought a lot about that, and I try to be mindful when I know other people might be going through something. It does make me really angry when people's response is like, everything happens for a reason, because it's just like, what could the reason possibly be? And one doctor, that was my doctor in the hospital, even said, in where I come from, people get illnesses like this as punishments for crimes they've committed in past lives. And I was like, what was my crime? Like, how do you know? And it all comes to this, like, there's everything happens for a reason. And it also applies to survival versus not survival. And I think that that's very damaging and dangerous to say, like, you survived for a reason, because the children who died did not die for any reason. They did not die because they weren't brave or strong, or they didn't fight hard enough. Like, they wanted to live and they didn't. And it's just a question of luck and science that I did live. And I think learning how to live with that, even the pandemic, I find that echoes a lot. Like, oh, we're all learning to be more grateful for the things we have. It's like, I was pretty grateful already. I didn't need a pandemic to be grateful. And I think that if you're in a situation where somebody's going through a hard time, whatever that hard time might be, instead of saying everything happens for a reason, you could say, how are you? How are you doing? And if you're not in person with the person, or you're not on the phone with them, I think it's better to say to something that isn't a question at all, because it doesn't make them feel like they have to respond. And I always think it's better to say something than to say nothing. I always think this. So many people who I was close with or not close with have reached out over the following months to my illness, or even the following years, saying, I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you. And I'm like, I didn't notice. Like, I'm sorry that this is burdening you. But if it burdened you, you maybe should have reached out. Like, I don't care, but it seems to be weighing on these people. And so I think reach out. If I see someone on Facebook is like, this thing happened, I'll send a private message and be like, I'm so sorry that this happened. That sounds really hard. I'm thinking of you. And just like, no comment, just thinking of you, and I'm sorry. I think that that's really does a lot.
Thank you for that practical advice.
Let's see what it's like if I turn on this lamp. I feel like that's
So, Andrea's question was sort of about some of the, I wouldn't say stereotypes, but these things that people say. And I'm also interested in sort of the tropes in this, and this idea of like, so let me back up. So at one point in the book, you're talking about trying to write this book, or trying to tell this story as a fictional story. And you had shared, parts of this with a friend. So like, here's a novel I'm working on. And your friend was like, this is unbelievable. Where's the love interest? Where's the this? Where's the that? And sort of talked about, it didn't have romance. It didn't have the idea of illness as a spiritual journey. And we found this video that we thought we would share called the Sick Girl Trope. So we're going to just share a little bit of this clip, and then we'll sort of ask some questions around this.
I will share my screen. Give me 1 second.
On screen, this ill-fated young woman can be identified not just by the fact that she's ill,
AZT break,
but by a set of recognizable characteristics. First and foremost, her life is defined by her sickness.
reality shows, doctor's appointments, 8 prescription drugs 3 times a day.
She may have other interests and an outgoing personality, but her ailments make them difficult to pursue.
I spend all my time indoors, behind special windows.
The sick girl is usually bursting with positivity. She's likable, outgoing, and nearly flawless.
She's the best person I've ever known.
Which makes her affliction all the more tragic. She's also unusual. Facing death has made her unapologetic about who she is. She can be unflinchingly candid.
Look, I don't want you hanging out with me. I don't need your stupid pity.
Or dreamy and whimsical.
Wonder where ghost horses go.
Even at the height of her illness, she's usually gorgeous.
God, you're beautiful.
Though she might not always be aware of it. She's also wise beyond her years.
19, but old for my age.
Full of pithy observations born from her unique perspective on life.
Maybe that's what heaven is. Maybe we go through life collecting people and places we love. And they become our heaven.
And she often exists solely to pass this wisdom on to a man, inspiring him to live his life to the fullest before she surrenders hers.
What do you get out of it?
I get to help you.
Other characters inevitably fall for the sick girl.
I am in love with you.
And usually so does the audience. And this makes saying goodbye to her all the more painful.
Tell a story, Christian.
Yet, while the sick girl seems to bring positive representation to people living with illness, it's a trope that often traffics in cliches, and it creates unrealistic expectations that can be harmful. Here's our take on the sick girl and the role she plays, and whether it may be time to let her go.
I thought that was so funny because I don't think that I'd realized just how much of a trope it was. I thought that there were just like a few isolated incidences of this, and seeing it all pieced together like that, it's kind of crazy.
And of course, that's movies. I think books might be, different mediums might be different things, but I think it seems to be like this long-standing thing. And what I love about your book is that it stands entirely apart from these tropes. And tell us a little bit more about your thoughts about these romanticized notions of particularly girls in illness, and what new stories do you think that we need?
Well, when I was writing the novel that I talk about trying to write in the book, I think it was important for me to explore the possibility of my dying. And the girl always died in the novel that I was writing. And it was just something that I feel like I actually needed to work through. And to see how it impacted like her family and the community, but try to do that in a way that showed like not weakness in dying, because I think that it's like the ultimate loss. But I tried to always make it like it was this character's choice, even though it wasn't her choice. And I think that writing this, I just was trying to write the truth of what happened. And in that way, it felt so easy. It's like, I just have to write what really happened and how I really felt about it. And I found that it just like the click of satisfaction being like, yeah, that's what it was, rather than like, should this be it? Or should I change it like this? So I found it being able to incorporate all of these things that had really happened in my life and those conversations with people as well. And another conversation that I think is really important in the book is when I was telling somebody else about it and they're like, well, so the girl died, like, did you want to die? And that sort of shifted my perspective and like, why am I trying to write this book? And my story is one of hope, essentially, because I lived and I wasn't expected to live. The prognosis was very poor. It was a big surprise for the medical community in a lot of ways that I lived. And I think that it is really important to tell stories of hope where we can. And so this book doesn't fit in with that trope because of the nature of it that I lived. And the trope is that like there's this sacrificial death. And I think that was more important than I realized when I started writing the fiction, that I should just tell, if I can give people hope, why wouldn't I do that?
Yeah.
And I think this might kind of tie to that. There's a moment when you are writing and you're online sort of looking up, natural killer leukemia, and you see somebody say there's no known survivors. And, you having this moment where you're like, but I am a survivor. So I wanted to kind of ask you how this book helped you let people know that you exist and how this book helped you feel more seen.
I think that in a very literal way, it made me feel seen, right? Like my story is out there now, but I also think that it was just really important for me to let this story go, because it was a story that I'd just been carrying in my heart and my head for so long. And I've never really had the feeling in writing of things being cathartic. But this really did feel like I could move on from it defining me in such a way. Like that was something in the trope that like sickness defines her, but I think that that's true. And those are comments that I got about the novel. And it was something that I was interested in playing with in this memoir of like, people say like, well, we need to see the girl before she got sick. It's like, I was the same girl before I got sick. I'm the same girl while I was sick. There is no massive transformation. And the way that it's like, we can start a novel in the middle of the war and we're not gonna be like, I wanna see what this soldier was like before the war. It's like, it's in media res, and we see a lot about who a character is based on how they respond to conflict. And this was my conflict, and that was how I responded.
Yep, I love it. You also speak to this idea of residue, of trauma in the body. And we've heard this idea in lots of different contexts. Effects after injury, illness, abuse, war, also systemic oppression across generations and more. It's something that intergenerational trauma is more of a concept, and now it's being studied more. Tell us more about this, the elements of this that you explored in your book, and what kinds of supports do you think we need more of, given your experience with this and learnings from it?
So I think that one of the sections that I explore that in the most literal way is where I'm like, if you're diagnosed with a fatal illness and then you survive, it's sort of like being held up with a gun and then learning that it's a fake gun. Like the person who held up the fake gun will still be prosecuted because the intent was to kill. And same with this like natural killer leukemia, the intent was to kill, the fear is the same. And it takes a long time to let go of that fear. And the fear of a cold coming back would spark panic. Bruises, I'd be like, oh my God, because I was covered in bruises and had like, yeah, all sorts of these symptoms from low platelet counts that came when I was leading up to my diagnosis. So I think that like, yeah, and I still find my scar a very sensitive. I have 2 scars from the permanent port IVs that I had. And one especially is very sensitive to me. Like I don't like touching it, and I don't like Arlo touching it, my son. And I think that I didn't realize at the time, and it wasn't that I was like deciding to live. It didn't feel like that. And of course it wasn't my decision that made any outcome, that made the change of any outcome. But years later, when I was diagnosed with like pre-cancer of the cervix, which like so many women experience, it was this deep trigger for me that I realized just how much fear was still living in my body. And I felt at that point, I was like, if this is something that I can decide to fight and like get chemo and everything or not, like I don't know if I could possibly decide to fight. I put all my fight in before, and it was just like very, even though I didn't ever have to go to that, it just was really very triggering, and that made me realize just how embedded the fear of that experience was for me. Like it's not a story of bravery and now it's over. It is the story of living with something for the rest of your life. I found that in terms of what supports we could use more of, I found it very difficult to transition from being a patient at SickKids to being a patient at Princess Margaret, the adult hospital. And it just always seemed very impersonal. The doctors that I saw there for my checkups were like, so anything about your cancer that you're still living with? No? Okay, bye. And I might be like, well, I have all this anxiety and issues of sleeping and this pre-cancer thing. And they're like, that's not related. Bye. And recently, one of the nurses who was like my main nurse that I renamed Jenna in my book, I've been in touch with her over Instagram, which has been so nice to reconnect with her. And she said that she was part of a team setting up like national childhood cancer survivor aftercare programs. And the person who I now see at Princess Margaret, who I had been seeing for several years before this nurse told me about that, I was like, oh my God, like you must work with this person. And she's like, yes, we're in the same office. I hired her. Like, and she's a nurse that I had at SickKids too. And so it's having somebody understand what you went through and be familiar with your record and not being like, so tell me what's the story that I'm going over here? Like a 23-year-old freshly out of medical school, doing like the 10-minute follow-up. So having someone take the time, like she calls, if we have like once a year appointments, and this time it was virtual, of course, and it just, well, not of course, but it didn't need to be in person. And she called 15 minutes early and was like, I just wanted to make sure that you had the time to talk about all that you needed to talk about, and how has COVID been impacting you? Is there any anxiety coming up as a result of that? And it just felt so holistic, and like she's interested in whatever I have to say, and won't dismiss it for being like, well, that's unrelated. And connected to that, there's a free therapy program at Princess Margaret for people who have had cancer or people who currently have cancer. And I have used that program several times, and I find it very helpful. You're often paired with a student or the supervisor, and it's just, of course, like that should be available to people.
Just as a follow-up question, I think you are doing something very special on the internets right now with your book material and creating a bit of a space. You want to share a bit about that?
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, my partner Cal is a web developer, and part of what's also embedded in the website, we were talking about these journals and the medical records, but another aspect that's embedded in the book are these like blog updates, I guess. And my cousin in England, who felt very far away and couldn't help. He was 15 also at the time, and he knew how to make websites. So he made this really basic like tripod website and added forums. And so my parents and I could post forum updates for all of our family around the world, and friends could post messages. And so many of those forum updates are incorporated in the blog. And I just thought it would be a really nice idea to create the space for other people to share their stories through this platform too. So Cal, my partner, who you'll learn all about in the book, set up this section on my website where I incorporated some of my original forum posts and some pictures from the time, and people can share their stories, because I think that it can be so helpful for people to feel seen and heard.
Lovely. Thank you for doing that.
Thanks, Andrea.
I'm just going to encourage folks to add questions to the Q&A. This is going to be the last question before we move over to Q&A. And Harriet, I wanted to go back to something that you were saying earlier, but I'm also weighing it against the sick girl trope. So earlier today, we talked about sort of the magicalness of everyday life, and like atoms and all these things are magical. And we've also sometimes heard this idea that people who've experienced life-threatening situations, they may take more positive risks, they may pursue passions, they may seek out what's really important to them. So I want to just, with the risk of sounding like a sick girl trope, tell us about how this experience has changed and how this journey has sort of impacted your time, your choices, your decisions, your parenting style. What do you think, and it's hard to know because you have lived this life, but how do you see the differences between you and maybe others around the way that you approach some of these choices and some of these, you know, the idea of time, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question, and it is so hard to answer because it's like I don't know what the alternate path would have been. But now that I was looking back at the timeline of what happened, really, I do like, so I was diagnosed in May of 2002, missed the end of grade 9, went back to school in January of 2003, so also missed the first semester, and was still receiving follow-up medication, not chemotherapy, but follow-up medication to treat some of the side problems that had happened as a result of the chemotherapy and having such a weak immune system. Like I had fungus in my lungs and infections and stuff like that. So I was still fragile and I was still on those drugs, but I had missed quite a lot of school. And my parents, some of my friends were doing a study abroad program like through Ontario, that was like through Ontario curriculum. I would get a high school credit for going to do a study abroad program in England. And I went by myself. Like I have tons of family in England, but my parents are both from there, but I went by myself. I had to get like a letter saying I could bring these new radical non-FDA approved drugs across borders. My hair was still super short, freshly growing out. Like I was very vulnerable. And I just like was there by myself. The following year, I did a similar thing in Costa Rica. And I lived in Halifax for university, which was like a 29-hour train ride from where I grew up. I did my third year in Paris. So I think that I can see that one of the consequences of having, like, I can see that my parents might have been like, no, stay close to home. We've got to get you, like, make sure that you go to your checkups and all that. And I just really wanted to live, and they really encouraged me to do that. And I'm really grateful that they didn't try and keep me close, because that wouldn't have been able to protect me from anything anyways. And in terms of my parenting style as a result of that, I try not to think about anything bad happening to my son. It's just like impossible to think about. But the confidence that my parents maintained around me and that like knowledge seeking, like I try and tell him everything that I think he has the comprehension to understand in a simple way. And I try to make sure that he feels confident and safe to explore whatever it is he wants to explore.
That's wonderful. So folks, put in your questions in the Q&A. We have some questions already there. I want to focus on this one. I think this is a really great question. Andrew asks, as a newbie writer in progress, she's working on a book of poems and fictional autobiography. So the thing about fearing publishing for the first time, she's saying that she keeps telling herself she should continue to write for the love of it, but the fear of actually publishing and telling her story and possibly facing criticism from family in particular, it's a real issue and it's intimidating. There's a lot of vulnerability with that. I would love to hear your thoughts around that, because I'm sure you had a lot of people in this book who, you know, I'm sure you had to ask some level of permission, but you were telling things about them and about them in the context of your story. Tell us about that vulnerability, about speaking to that kind of personal context, and what you do to kind of get over the fear of that when you're telling it more publicly.
So if it is a personal story and not fiction, I've seen a lot of people say, and I do think that I agree with this, like if it's something that happened to you, it is your story and you have the right to tell it. And in my book, I'm not hurting anybody. I changed the names of the doctors for privacy reasons and of the nurses and of any other patient involved. Nobody else is really named. It's like my mother, my father, Cal, but then it's just like a friend or an aunt. Because I just thought that the names would clutter things up. Then like if someone appears one time, we don't need to learn who this person is. So I think changing names is important, but yeah, you have the right to tell your story. And if there's legal ramifications that you need to look into, like I'm not the expert on that and you might need to look into it. But in terms of confidence, I think it's so hard. I've published 2 books. I have other ones that I'm working on. And I just think that that's something that I am constantly working on, to be like, is the point of this just to write the book, or is the point of this to get rich and famous? Like, it's obviously not to get rich and famous, but for me, I did want this book to be read and I wanted it to be seen. And I think that it will make a difference to a lot of people. And that's why I wanted to publish it and not just hold on to it. And it's why I didn't give up. Like I've been working on this for absolutely years. Like I'm 33 now and I had this when I was 15. This is a story that I've been thinking about for so long. And I think that it actually, I felt rushed at times, but I think that I wouldn't have been able to write this book. And I think that this book is the one that I needed to write. And I wouldn't have been able to write it until I did.
And along those lines, so we have a question about just the timeline of things. Did you start writing it as a memoir after you finished writing it as a novel? Did you start writing it as a novel and then switch? Like, tell us a bit about that novel to memoir process a bit.
Yeah, so I wrote it as a novel, completed the novel, did 1 million drafts of the novel, never published the novel. I was writing a lot of personal essays about my experience, and I just felt like that was so rewarding and easy, and I started publishing those kind of by coincidence. The publishing journey I always find is like very, very hard. And the one time in my life that I got asked to publish, they're like, do you have any personal essays? Like, I love your writing. And I was like, amazing. I've never even published anything, but like through the magazine that I ran, this person who had followed me through the magazine and read my writing through there. And I had just written my first ever personal essay and she published it. And it was one of the most popular articles on Vice. It was about being a life model, like a painter's model for my friend, and how I experienced, and I wove some of that into the book. The feeling of like becoming immortal, but also recognizing my mortality in becoming a painted object. So the personal essays were where I really felt like this story came alive. And I had started trying to write it. I think I mentioned like I wrote fragments of it, but then when I became pregnant, the whole book sort of expanded in my mind. And I saw my experience as a teenager through this different lens of having been now a mother to be, and empathizing with my parents in a way that I hadn't previously fully identified with. So that's sort of a bit more on the timeline.
Thank you. We just have a few more minutes, so we'll just ask, this is a great multi-part question, but I'm going to ask this piece in particular. What was the most challenging aspects of writing the book, and what inspired you most?
Challenging aspect was, I think the advice that I gave in the previous question, like, is if it happened to you, it's your story to tell. Like, learning to own that as well was hard. And But I didn't find it super challenging to write this book. I found it challenging until I wrote this book, if that makes sense. All the other attempts I found challenging.
And I'm going to ask this question because it's another great one. Support system. What was your support system like in writing the book and in publishing it? And even now, as you're starting to promote it and get it out into the world?
Oh, I thought they meant what was my support system at the time, but I think this one's a really interesting question too. I think that my agent is super supportive. I didn't think that the draft that I was working on was going to be anything. And I sent it to her and was like, is this anything? Should I keep working on this? And she's like, oh my God, this is perfect. We're sending this out. And she was really supportive. I was seeing and speaking with the therapist that I mentioned at Princess Margaret, and friends who are writers, friends who aren't writers, because there's a particular kind of empathy that a writer has of like the feeling of joy, but also like grief and letting go of a book and being like, now you're on your own. Like, I hope that you do well. And not feeling like you have a ton of control over that. My partner Cal is just super supportive. He's very grounding. I'll be like all worried about something and he'll be like, well, we haven't been given any reason to worry, so maybe just don't worry. That kind of stuff. And I find it very grounding. Yeah.
I'm really glad that Cal is a bit of a stable table, as we all need a stable table sometimes, so that's really lovely.
Totally, that's
So we are almost at the end of our time, but I want to throw it to Suzanne and ask if there's any last questions, anything that you want to say before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you're working on now, Harriet. What's coming down the pipeline for you? And are you finding this time an inspiring time or a time of clamming up?
Like the pandemic time or okay, so.
Or all of it, just all of the time, Harriet.
The next book that will come out that is a book that I co-wrote with an old friend, Rosa, who Andrea also knows. It's a children's book, and we co-wrote it a long time ago, and we revised it at the beginning of the pandemic. It's for like 4 to 8-year-olds. It's called Surge the Snail Without a Shell. And it's rhyming and it's very cute. And then the next book that I'm working on is a novel that's inspired by the life of a Hungarian Jewish scientist who invented the bomb and nuclear energy and the radiation machines that we still use today that cure cancer. And it's fictionalizing his life story and telling a lot of his story through the perspective of his wife, about whom we don't know very much, but it's giving her a voice as well. And I felt very pessimistic about the whole writing process, like childcare is much down and just feeling very like, what's the point of it all during this time? But I told my agent, like, do you think that we can try and sell this book before I finish it? Because I just feel very uninspired to finish it unless I know that I have to. And she said yes, and we've sent it out to just 2 editors that I worked with, and then we're in discussions with them now. So I'm super relieved that it will. I really thrive on deadlines, especially these days. And having a kid, it just felt like I didn't feel like I could commit abstract time to something if I didn't know that there would be anything that came out of it.
Thank you, Harriet. That is such exciting news of 2 books, a children's book. I hope folks heard that. A children's book that's really cute and cool with a co-author who's also cute and cool. And you've also got this great novel coming out that I think sounds so interesting. Also in light with this, like the radiation piece and yeah, how neat.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the way that it like fits into the arc of the other 2 books that I've published. So I am excited to work on it, and I'm excited to like have sort of a team, because I find writing so solitary, and it's just so nice to know that you have people that you can talk to along the way about it. But before we sign off, I really want to thank you 2 for having me, and it's been so lovely. Your questions were so thoughtful and interesting, and the work that you guys do is so amazing. And for all the participants, I didn't know this, but they started this program during the pandemic, and I think it's such an incredible way to highlight Canadian female writers, and the events that they put on are all amazing. The history, the backlog of the ones that they've done are so cool. So congratulations for this initiative, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of it.
you, Harriet. Really appreciate you. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you folks for joining us. After the event, we're going to be sending out a feedback survey. We really do read these feedback surveys, so please fill them out. They're really important for us to know what we can do next, what you thought about it, how we can make the format as engaging and interesting for you. And as Suzanne mentioned in the beginning, we're really wanting to just connect with you as this pandemic goes on. And we want the opportunity to get to speak with you again. So if you're interested in the work of the foundation, you can actually join us for a digital town hall coming up on February the 11th. It's at 4 o'clock. You're going to get updates, and you're also going to get the opportunity to speak about what you want to see happen, what kinds of things you think need to happen in communities. And we're going to be taking all that into consideration into our future planning. We don't know what the future is going to look like, but we want to hear from you, and we want to incorporate this into our thinking going forward, because we know gender justice is going to be the concern going forward, and we're here to build that up. That's our concern. And I'm also really going to share with you this great event that we're doing over Black History Month. It's going to be on February 19th. It's going to be a celebration of Black women's voices to mark the month. And we have some really stellar authors who are going to be joining us. And it's going to be led by our president and CEO, Paulette Sr. It's going to be really special. So we'll put all that information in the email so that you have an opportunity to join us again. And yeah, thank you so much. And I think really we were going to close with this idea that, as Suzanne said in the beginning, we need your support more than ever. So sign up for our mailing list, be in touch with us. If you can give a gift at this time, go to CanadianWomen.org. Your donation will help more than 10,000 women. That's a number of people, 10,000 women, girls, and gender diverse people that we support every year. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because we are also deep with communities and deep with organizations doing this work. That's part of our work to try to build this up and support the movement that's already happening in communities. So I really want to thank you again for your involvement, encourage you to be in touch with us. Read Natural Killer. It is awesome. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you, Suzanne.
Remind everybody that they get a discount for
Yes. So we have a link for this event, and you signed up on that link. Go to that link, and once you go there, you'll see that you can use a promo code. You get 25% off. It comes real fast, so please go ahead and do it, and get more than one so that you can share it with a family or a friend. Okay, thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the night. Bye-bye.